To order for Tuesday, November 30th, 2021. If we can all, or Mary Ellen, if you can call the roll, please.
Commissioner Walowski,
Yes.
Commissioner Volpe, Commissioner Tedesco,
Present.
Bach,
Here.
Commissioner Santago,
Here.
Alternate Commissioner Ma,
Here.
Alternate Commissioner Coles,
Present.
Alternate Commissioner Cavello, Alternate Commissioner Caird,
Here.
Vice Chair Salka,
Here.
Chair Hammersley.
Hammersley's here. I did hear from Christina Volpe. She will not be present tonight. And Joe Coviello is running a little bit late. If we could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
I ask you all to remain standing for a moment of silent reflection. Thank you. Moving on to item number 2 on the agenda, I want to introduce Glenn Shalder. I always screw it up, right? From Plan Metrics. Glenn is going to be giving us, I think, leading off with a presentation, and then we're going to open it up to members of the public to offer their comments. So Glenn, take it away.
I'd like to be able to roam the room if I can, so can everybody hear me on the commission audience? Or should I
No. Use the microphone.
Use the mic.
Mike, all right. Stuck here. You're stuck with me at this point from this location. My name is Glenn Shalder. I'm a planning consultant. I've been asked to work with the Planning and Zoning Commission in the town of Southington on preparing an affordable housing plan for the community. I've worked with Southington before. I assisted in preparation of the 2016
Yep.
Plan of Conservation and Development. And through that, I did a lot of research and investigation into Southington. So I'm familiar with the community, and I'm excited to be back to have a chance to work with the commission and the community overall. So I put together a PowerPoint to kind of guide our conversation today, at least get us started. And then, as the chair indicated, we're looking for public comment and input. So let me get started. In 2017, the legislature passed a public act that requires each municipality in Connecticut to prepare an affordable housing plan by June 1 of next year. So Southington is joined by 168 other communities in the Connecticut doing this effort. The state legislation says that the plan shall specify how the municipality intends to increase the number of affordable housing developments in the community. They've also indicated that these plans need to be updated every 5 years. So this will be an ongoing effort in Southington and other communities in terms of how we can address some housing challenges overall. And setting housing in Southington is not new. Certainly in the 2016 Plan of Conservation and Development, housing was a key topic, and it's been in previous plans of conservation and development. So it's something that the town has been looking at for many years. And part of the reason why we're looking at this, I feel, is described in this chart here. What this chart shows is the relationship between housing prices and incomes over time. And the information that's on this chart goes from the 1960s here to 2018 over here. And this red line is a rule of thumb for the cost of housing. If housing costs more than 3 times somebody's income, it can be a housing cost burden. So when it's below the line, as it was in the 60s, for many people, housing was much more affordable relative to income than it is today. But as we got towards the mid 70s, people who were baby boomers, anybody here, 1945 to 1965? Well, once we started buying houses, we put pressure on the housing market, and housing prices relative to income started to go up towards this line and bubbled along until the 1990s. This is the housing spike in the early 2000s. It dropped back a little bit, but it's now increased. And actually what's missing on here is what we're now calling the COVID bump, which is another increase in housing prices that has continued. So the challenge really is that housing over time has become more and more unaffordable for many people. And the question you may want to ask yourselves, if you didn't have home equity today, would you have the down payment necessary to purchase a house in today's market? And for many people, the answer is no. And so that's the challenges that our children, our grandchildren, and others will continue to face in terms of housing and housing affordability issues. It's at and beyond the limit of what people can naturally afford. So the state now requires that we prepare this specific housing affordability plan, and that's why we're here tonight, to get comments and input and feedback from you. Now, in terms of planning for housing, we're planning for housing because, first of all, everybody needs housing. Everybody needs housing of different types, flavors, and characteristics. They want it to be affordable. They want it to be available when and where needed. And they want housing to offer options and choices. And the concept of being available when and where needed is an important one because, for example, the Housing Authority has a waiting list at the present time. And so somebody may need housing today or soon, and the Housing Authority can't always accommodate people on that short a basis. It takes time. So planning for housing is an important issue. And people benefit when they have access to housing in a lot of ways. This is a statewide survey, the results of a statewide survey that was done in California. And it sort of grouped the benefits from housing for people in three broad categories. The first of which, and 43% identified this as being the most important element for them, was shelter and personal safety. Your home is your castle. It is the place where you can relax, regenerate, etc. And that provision of shelter and personal safety is an important attribute. The next category was financial stability and security, that it allows people to accumulate and generate wealth, to pass wealth to future generations through tax deductions, through accumulation of equity in their homes. It provides financial stability and security. And also, housing provides a sense of belonging to a community. People invest in the community. They become invested socially, economically, and otherwise. And it provides access to opportunities. So people benefit from housing and housing choices. But a community also benefits from housing and housing choices. We can provide housing options for people for their whole lives. We can support a stronger economy by having housing for a diverse range of people and incomes. And it also promotes community togetherness. But as I indicated, more and more people are finding it harder and harder to afford housing. Some people have called it a housing crisis. I don't know if it falls to the level or rises to the level of a crisis, but it should be a concern in Southington because it includes people who already live here. When we look at census information, what we find is that 26% of Southington households earn less than $50,000 per year. And then when we look at the value of owner-occupied housing units, what we can see is housing can cost 4 to 6 times that in that category and higher. So there's not always housing for people at modest income levels. Census data indicates that about 26% of Southington households are cost burdened. They're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So think about your own situation in terms of what you're paying for housing and what your income is. And is it close to 30% or higher? In which case housing can be more of a strain or a struggle for people, particularly if they're living on modest incomes. In addition, the United Way prepares an analysis of what they called ALICE households. ALICE stands for asset limited, meaning you don't have tremendous wealth or resources on the side. Income constrained, you're working regular jobs, but perhaps not earning higher salaries. And E means employed. So you're asset limited, income constrained, and employed. 28% of the Southington households fall into that category. And these people typically earn less than the basic cost of living. So these people are struggling as well. And I think that the thing that's important for us to consider is that these are people who already live here. 72% of Southington's housing portfolio is in one flavor of housing. It's single family. And so single family detached housing works for a lot of people, but doesn't necessarily work for everybody. The little Baskin & Robbins logo down here is a little bit of a joke. That even Baskin & Robbins has 31 flavors of ice cream. If we all went to the ice cream store, we don't have to have one flavor. We can all pick our own. And housing can be the same way. Why can't we have more flavors of housing? 83% of Southington's housing stock is owner occupied, and maybe less affordable, and 17% is rental and maybe more affordable, but there just aren't as many units as people might want or need. So Southington does have different types of affordable housing today. One category is what the state recognizes as affordable housing units in a community. And this can include assisted housing units, such as the Housing Authority, deed-restricted housing units, and also tenant rental assistance units and home buyer assistance units. Anybody have any idea of how many units we might have in Southington? Anybody want to throw a number out? Well, that's maybe total housing units. But how many affordable? Anybody? 967. So if I said to you there's almost 1,000 affordable housing units already in Southington, people I've spoken to so far have indicated a little bit of surprise at that number. They didn't realize we had as much as we had. And even though we have that many, we still don't quite have enough. But those 967 state recognized units is about 5% of the housing stock in the community. About 500 units are the Housing Authority units. About 51 are deed restricted units. 354 units are qualifying households that got CHFA mortgages, which allowed them to purchase a home with a smaller down payment, more favorable mortgage terms, if you will. And then rental assistance units, people occupying rental units. Now, there are other types of affordable housing in town. We have something we call naturally occurring affordable housing. These can be housing units that sell or rent at affordable prices, but they're not counted by the state because they're not deed restricted at that. This could include mobile homes. It could include small condominiums and other types of housing like that, which can be affordable for people, but the state doesn't count them. They can be smaller, older. The location may not be as desirable as some other locations in town. They could be what we call fixer-uppers, a house that perhaps has needed some TLC for a while. But again, because they're not deed restricted, they don't count on the state's list. And even so, there's still, when we put the state recognized and the naturally occurring affordable together, there's still not enough in Southington to meet the need. And this slide, I think, is an important one too. The slide here talks about the elephant in the room. And part of the elephant in the room is what's called 830G. 830G is known as the state's Affordable Housing Appeals Procedure. And because Southington's housing stock is below 10%, the number I threw out just a little while ago is 5%, we're about halfway there, we are subject to the Affordable Housing Appeals Procedure. And what this means is that developers can propose developments containing affordable housing that doesn't necessarily have to comply with local zoning. So they can submit applications, again, which don't comply with local zoning. As part of the Plan of Conservation and Development for Southington, we had a housing section. It recommends addressing future housing needs. Strategy or policy is consider ways to provide housing opportunities consistent with soil types, terrain, and infrastructure capacity, and look at ways to modify regulations, if you will, to address some housing affordability issues. There's a map in the plan. It talks about trying to encourage housing opportunities in and near the town center in Plantsville, areas served by water and sewer, areas close to services, et cetera, in the center of town. And that's sort of some of the strategic recommendations in the POCD. So overall, I hope by this point in time, you've developed an understanding that housing costs are a challenge for a lot of different people, and housing choices and options can do a lot to help address housing needs in the community. And part of the challenge is this. Developers often want to build housing in the $400,000 to $500,000 range because that's where they can make the most money. But so many people need housing in the $100,000 to $200,000 range. And you can't get up here without having started down here someplace. So the issue, if you will, is what can we do? to try to promote housing choices and housing options and support the overall housing market. And again, the idea, as the state has indicated, is let's prepare a plan for this. So the potential housing vision that might be appropriate for Southington is for us to seek ways to expand the variety of housing choices in Southington to help meet the needs of people and families of all ages, incomes, and characteristics, to diversify our housing supply overall. And some of the strategies could fall into 3 different categories. Look at ways to try to increase the amount of assisted housing. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Look at ways to increase deed-restricted housing. I'll talk about that as well. And then also looking at ways to just increase overall housing diversity so we have more flavors of housing to meet people's housing needs over time. Now, assisted housing is housing which receives financial assistance generally from the state or federal government. This is mortgage financing or other construction financing, which allows it to be more affordable. That funding is generally given to housing authorities or nonprofit developers or for-profit developers. And because of these efforts over time, we've got almost 499 units in Southington today. And so one of our options is to look at ways to try to increase that assisted housing in the future. Another strategy could be look at ways to increase deed-restricted housing. And there might be sort of 2 different scenarios here. The town could enable deed-restricted housing. This is housing that would be restricted for some period of time, a certain percentage of the number of units, and the town could enable this or incentivize it or even require this type of housing. And if the town doesn't, the other option here is what's called a set-aside development under the statute. This is the affordable housing appeals procedure where a developer can propose it and it doesn't have to comply with local zoning. At the present time, the state records indicate that Southington has 51 units of deed-restricted housing at the present time. And then there can also be strategies to look at ways to increase overall housing diversity in the community. This can address the situation of families whose needs have changed. If couples get separated or divorced, you turn one housing or household into 2. What happens in those situations, particularly if parents want to stay near their kids in the school system? We have older households downsizing, the kids have moved away, and people say, I don't want or need as big a house. What can they do or where could they go? Younger people or families just starting out looking for their first apartment, their first condominium, their first home. Smaller units for smaller households. The census data indicates that about 60% of the housing units in most Connecticut municipalities are occupied by 1 or 2 people. And you think about the size of housing units we have, and sometimes people say, I just don't want that much housing anymore. And also more housing choices which are less expensive. What other options might there be? So there can be other housing flavors relative to size, cost, tenure, or amenities. Common interest community with a pool or other types of amenities, golf courses, these types of things that might appeal to people's lifestyle. We certainly can try to guide the location and design of different types of housing, where they might go in the community and how they might be configured or designed, including mixed-use buildings, for example, where we have residential units above first-floor retail, what's called cottage courts or pocket neighborhoods, which are smaller condominiums organized around a central green, often a compact type of development pattern. Townhouses. You can also have 2 or 3 family dwellings as well. So as part of this discussion or analysis, people sometimes come to the conversation or discussion about affordable housing with some possible concerns. And so one of the concerns that people sometimes express is, we never had to address this before. How come the state is making us do this today? And I'd like you to think back to the chart I shared with you earlier in terms of how the housing crisis and the prices have kind of risen out of control, and say that the issues are really not as pronounced as they are these days, and they may get even more pronounced in the future. So I think some basic internet research will provide some additional information on this type of situation. It's not unique to Southington, it's not unique to Connecticut. The second issue can be just a misunderstanding in terms of housing issues or choices. And so there's some opportunities to do some great research. AARP has some wonderful documents that really talk about housing, not just for seniors, but also, for example, this report, Housing for a Changing America, talks about how our demographics are changing and how there's interest in different types of housing choices for people, appropriate for their situations or lifestyles. This information here from the National Low Income Housing Organization contains a lot of information particular to Connecticut about the types of situations or scenarios that exist in our state. There's statewide organizations. This one's called the Partnership for Strong Communities. They have a website with frequently asked questions, which provide information about housing and how many communities have accommodated housing in ways that fit in with their overall character. Density. People are concerned, but it's going to be denser than what we have today. And I think density is really an issue that relates to the design of a development in a very significant way. And you can take developments at the same density, but with different design characteristics, and one of them looks much denser than the other. So I think it's important for us to be clear, if you will, about our importance that we're going to place on design so that the issues related to density are not as pronounced. And I think there's some opportunities to do some great research on this as well. People sometimes express concerns about property values, that property values would be affected by affordable housing. Trulia, which you may have heard of, is a nationwide real estate, not unlike Zillow, did a study and found that in the nation's 20 least affordable housing markets, low-income housing built during a 10-year span showed no effect on nearby home values. People sometimes express concern about school enrollments. In school enrollments, it turns out that single-family detached homes are the #1 generator of school-age children. And even in Southington, enrollments have been decreasing over time. In the 2019, it looks like a typo, it should be 2019 to 2020 enrollment was less, about a little more than a third of a pupil per housing unit. And so it's not the impact that people tend to think it is or could be in terms of school enrollments, and it's much less for multifamily units. So I think this is the point now we'd like to open it up for public thoughts or comments. I think your information is going to be relevant to the work being done with the commission in terms of preparing a plan for Southington. The categories of possible strategies that look forward to your feedback on or other issues that you're concerned about, ways that we could increase assisted housing in town, deed restricted housing in town, increasing overall housing diversity, or other ideas that you might have. So, yes.
I had a question.
Can you do me a favor? Can you
we-
stand up?
can we
That
just-
way
Glenn, just
everybody in the room will hear.
Glenn, hold on a second. Just because we have someone who's recording this for us, I'd like whoever is talking to come up to the mic, state your name and address for us, just so we can get it as part of the minutes.
Thanks, bud. I'm usually loud enough. I don't need one of these, but Mitch.
Glenn, excuse me one second. Glenn, there's a mic over there, so you could just talk into that one if you wanted to. Yeah, just twist it around. Sorry. Go ahead. Name and address.
I'm Mitch Silverberg, resident on Pleasant Street. I had a question about why is it that the mobile homes or whatever you want to use the term trailer parks, why are they not included in the low income housing? Because there are places inside of Southington that rent for $100 to $120 a month. And if you're renting a unit for $100 to $120 a month, you don't have to be making all that much a year to not be hitting that 30% of your income. So why are those excluded? Why did the state choose? I realize it's not you guys, it's the state. Why did they do that? Has anyone asked them that question? And this idea that they're not permanent, I grew up in West Haven, guys. There's still a mobile home there that was there when I was 5, and I'm now 64. So that's pretty permanent to me. They stay. They don't go away. So why is the state doing that? Anybody? I mean, why? That's my first question. I'm not totally done, but
You got a lineup of, yeah,
I
awesome.
have one other.
Yeah, perfect. I'll tell you what, why don't you stay there and I'll take this one for a second here. So the state developed the rationale in terms of what counts state's affordable housing appeals list roughly 30 years ago. And the category did not include mobile homes, but they changed it since that time. So the first reason is they're typically not deed restricted. And so the state requires that deed restriction be one criteria. And they have made an exception for resident-owned mobile home parks. The common situation is that an individual would own the land and lease a site to somebody who brings their own trailer in. But if the tenants, the occupants, own the land, then the state will count that because it's deed restricted. I don't make the rules. I'm just
saying that. Needs to ask them why. Why? That's not how most mobile homes are. Heck, about half of America lives in rented buildings anyway. 50% of the nation, around 50%, lives in rented properties. So are those all not included, or are they under that? Can you? That was my other question. What is this term deed restricted? Good question. Because I don't know that anybody don't know what that means either.
Yes, I can. Thank you. Yeah. So
And the last thing I wanted to ask about, we're talking about the possibility of not allowing for mother and daughter-in-law type of situations. One of the biggest areas you're going to need housing is for grandma and grandpa. Because with the way nursing homes are in this country now, a lot of people aren't going into them anymore. So why is that excluded too? Okay, those are my 3 questions.
got them. So the first question was the question of deed restricted. The state requires that units be preserved as affordable housing in some way, shape, or form. So what I described earlier as assisted housing is housing that gets state funding, and as part of that funding, it is required that they rent to eligible households. So on deed restricted, it's the same requirement. It's got to have something in the land records for either a rental unit or a sale unit that requires that it be sold or rent at the appropriate price for a certain period of 40 years. So if it's a fixer-upper that could get fixed up and become unaffordable, it doesn't count anymore. So the state has said deed restricted is that requirement. And by deed restricted, it's got to be on the deed on the land records. The second question has to do with what are called in-law apartments or accessory dwelling units, which is why I wrote down ADU. And these can be situations where a secondary dwelling unit is allowed as part of the house. I think, Mary Ellen, you allow them in Southington today?
Parent, grandparent apartments, yes.
Correct. So it's not that this town's saying that they won't do it. The state adopted legislation this past session, and the town is saying we like our regulations, and we're going to opt out of the states. Is that true?
Opt out, yes.
Yeah. Anybody else? Other questions, comments? Absolutely. Is it okay
So
if I-
just, yeah, Pam, just as you're coming up, I just want to explain to everybody, no, you can come up, that's okay. I just want to explain to everybody that we're going to try to limit the public comments for each person to let's say around 5 minutes, just to give everyone an opportunity to talk and also to give Glenn an opportunity to respond back. We have a hard stop somewhere around 9 o'clock, so
I'll try to be brief.
we don't usually do that on planning and zoning, but tonight I think that we just want to make sure everybody has an opportunity. So, Mr. Paulo, go ahead.
Thank you. Pamela Jade DiPaolo, 54 Delahunty Drive, resident and owner of DiPaolo's Furniture in Center Street. Well, I wrote a whole bunch of stuff, so I'll try to keep it brief here. I'm hoping that maybe there could be a modification of the statutes, of state statutes relating to in-law apartments that are in the affordable category, but don't include the 40-year deed restriction, which was just explained. So any dwellings of an affordable description which are not included in a compilation of qualified housing to be considered affordable should have the criteria changed maybe to include those dwellings. And I think that's what Mitch is trying to say also. Mobile homes should be included as affordable because they're among the most affordable units that I know of because I have customers who live in those homes. And Southington has a good number of mobile homes. Then you have the example of Pulaski Terrace in Plantsville, which has been in the news lately. Provides us with a community of local residents in a complex managed by the state. And the state has to provide a certain level of building management and improvements to the structures, which I was told by a resident does need repairs. The recent effort to build an office inside the community room, took away a large portion of the community space, and they took the walls down after, I guess, according to what I understand from the news, after residents questioned why they were losing a substantial portion of this space. This demonstrates a certain amount of maybe communication needs to be improved there. So if the state, in my opinion, if the state is going to put forward a legislation to encourage affordable housing construction, it should also get its own house in order and make sure that existing state-funded housing is adequate in terms of living conditions for these seniors who live there, from what I understand. So Southington residents and the majority senior citizens living at Pulaski Terrace, they deserve no less. They have to have a voice for promoting their quality of life. Chairwoman Vicky Triano has followed up with this matter and certainly has an obligation to these seniors to advocate on their behalf of any assistance is needed. Any new affordable housing units under consideration in Southington should have a strict oversight by town officials to guarantee a minimum level of reasonable quality space building standards and also enough variation in the type of housing provided within the proper and time-tested zoning regulations to make affordable units safe and family-friendly. I would like to suggest that all housing developments going forward with a large number of homes would maybe be an approval of maybe when you have a large number of homes, such as, for example, the new Churchill Street development would be required. Perhaps this could be just a consideration, could be required to include a certain percentage of affordable homes. So in other words, instead of we backtrack a year ago and you said to Mark Lovely, well, Mr. Lovely, you want to propose 30 units in here. We're going to require you to provide 5 or 6 units of affordable housing. And you can plan it in so that a certain number would be architecturally matched so that it would actually visually fit into the development. And so many would be dedicated. They can be designed like a condo complex with some homes freestanding and others affordable units as duplexes or et cetera, whatever, within the larger development. Lastly, as a community, we must be able to carefully plan out the affordable housing units without destroying the charm and the small town feel that Southington has always had, but is gradually losing. The commercial development on West Street in the past 6 to 8 years, it is at breakneck speed, and the traffic pollution bottlenecks loss of what was once a beautiful street to heavy development is changing Southington in ways that are not always positive. I believe our town services, fire department, police department, and water and sewer will be affected as the development increases. So the strains and the demands on our municipal systems are going to be something that we're going to have to talk about. So at what point will our resources be stretched to their limits? We are overloading our streets with too many vehicles and no public transportation in place, with the exception of the senior center shuttles and so forth. How do we add high-density housing without creating more pollution and traffic problems? If the pandemic has taught us anything, one of them I see is that many people are leaving the big cities to move away from living too close together, and that this trend will continue as people continue to move away from large metropolitan areas to more suburban ones like ours. We are gradually transitioning into a city from a suburb. While increasing more space for affordable homes, we must at the same time balance the need with avoiding the creation of high-rise, multi-floor apartment buildings. Then we will have all the problems associated with cities. So if the state is asking municipalities to provide more affordable housing, it must take the responsibility of managing its own state housing units in such a way that they provide a model for others to imitate. If they cannot do this, our town planners and the municipalities and in Southington know their towns. We know our towns. We see what is possible in our community, but it will require hard work and the participation of a lot more people who care about what happens, not only in their own neighborhood, but in the town as a whole. More residents need to come to these meetings, and eventually some consensus has to be reached. We cannot afford to be retroactive anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paulo. As always, you did a great job there. So, Glenn?
Great comments. I hope I got them all, and
I'm sure she'll be available to meet up if you missed anything. Have a conversation with you. So, come on up. Pam, I wouldn't cut you off.
Good evening. My name is James Sokoncik. I'm an engineer land surveyor, president of the firm of Cratzer, Jones and Associates. I have done affordable housing applications both for myself and for clients. And I think that is a fork in the road, but there are other forks in the road. I encourage this commission to look at that other type of housing that doesn't necessarily need the deed restriction, missing from his chart where he's showing the cost and unaffordability of housing is the fact that the average size of the house has increased from 1,200 square feet in 1970 to about 2,400 square feet today. And my son lives in a beautiful neighborhood of 50 by 50 lots with public roads, and the kids are playing in the streets, and the New Yorkers are dying to move there now. Let's consider those kind of neighborhoods. If we look at the neighborhoods, many of which were built during the Second World War, a bunch of small capes with expansion capabilities, we should look into changing our zoning regulations so those become affordable. The elephant in the room is a developer who has to make a profit. And zoning regulations that increase the costs by, large setbacks, 40 feet instead of 25 feet, and many other things make those unaffordable. What I'm saying is, let's try to develop housing that can be eligible for the state financing, perhaps a requirement that the first 2 months that housing unit is for sale, it is restricted to CHFA type housing if the guy can get approved. After that, it can go to market rate. But I think we should look into that also.
Thanks, James. Any other comments? Yep, Mike?
Good evening, Mike Riccio, 124 Andrew Street here in Southington. I have something prepared, and then I listened to, which I thought was an excellent presentation, by the way. So I'm going to do both. And I don't sugarcoat it, as most of you know. In looking at the presentation, a lot of what we saw was home prices. And this idea, this Clinton era idea that everybody needs to own a house, which is a lot of what the presentation was about, home ownership. A lot of what the deed restrictions are and why they won't include mobile home parks where the land is rented is all about ownership. And I don't agree with that. Not everybody needs to own a house. Not everybody wants to own a house. People want housing diversity, and I'll read this in a minute. But I just did, and Sev and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but to build a house today, $150 a square foot. Right? It's $150 a square foot, at least. Just for the material. That's a 600 square foot house, guys. And you haven't even bought the land yet. So unless the legislature in Hartford's going to come down here and start writing checks for everybody that we're going to end up paying for anyway, it just doesn't work. When my wife and I got married, we could not afford to buy a house. Couldn't. So we rented. And then when we could afford to buy a house, we bought a 2-family. It was 1 bedroom. And I think that apartment was 600 square feet. And then we still couldn't afford to buy a single family house. So we got a little bit bigger 2-family house. And that's okay. And I would encourage my kids to do the same thing because my son graduates college this year. He doesn't have any money. He can't afford to buy a house. Go rent. Go buy a 2-family house. Go buy a mobile home. And this idea that mobile homes are mobile, well, they're not campers. They're not campers. You can't go in there and wheel the thing out tomorrow. They are beautiful. The mobile home parks that are in Southington, even though they're on rented land, are stunning. I do want to summarize my thoughts here, so I'll just read this because I'll start to ramble. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to start out by saying that as a 50-year resident of this great community, I'm extremely proud of the diversity that our community offers. Contrary to what some might say, or what you might read in the news or see on a mural, Southington offers people diversity on all levels, and most importantly, housing. We have housing that young people can start out in, such as apartments in our numerous multifamily houses that exist and surround our downtown. We offer apartment buildings that are affordable, small, medium, and large condominiums, small, medium, and large houses, senior living, both apartment style and larger retirement communities. We have senior public housing, modular home neighborhoods, formerly known as trailer parks, and the so-called affordable housing communities. What we don't have are housing projects. And thanks to the late John Weichsel, we should be thankful for that. Those experimental housing complexes from the 1960s were found to be abject failures, which is why most of them in cities across this country have been or are being torn down. What are we? We are the quintessential suburb, and by no means should we be embarrassed by that. On the contrary, we should embrace it and continue to make it a great place to live. And I think that most of our residents would agree. People that live in this community, or other suburbs for that matter, do so because that is a lifestyle that they have worked for. Recent laws passed in Hartford are aimed at creating more homogeneity between the suburbs and the cities, and that, in my opinion, is wrong. The leadership and politics of the cities for years failed their residents. Instead of their state legislators, who, let's face it, control the state legislature, forcing their failed policies on us, let's have a sit down with the cities and show them what great leadership is all about and how to create housing diversity like we have here in Southington. Bridgeport figured it out. Stamford figured it out. New Haven figured it out. All are amazing cities with amazing neighborhoods and great places to live at every level. It's time to turn the dialogue around in this state, stop the smoke and mirror show, and have real discussions about holding leaders accountable for their actions and not look to shoulder their failures and problems on everyone else. Because at the end of the day, that is what this discussion here tonight is all about. We have abided by their failed laws, and guess what? They don't work. Case in point, look at Hillcrest here in Southington. It's an affordable housing project on Meriden-Waterbury Road. During one of the great runs in our history, in Connecticut and across this country, in real estate, they have not been able to sell their affordable housing units. The whole place is sold out. A year ago, I think they had 50 housing units available. Now there are none, sold out, except for their affordable housing units. Why? Because the rules and laws and the hoops that the so-called affordable housing buyers are expected to jump through are unattainable. And it's absolutely ludicrous. And, you know, we talked about, in the beginning of this discussion, we heard about creating equity in your home. Well, guess what, folks? Affordable housing does not allow equity for 25 years. How is that helping anybody? Tell those people to go rent. Because it's no different. At the end of 25 years, what have they saved? So we can't hide behind the failures in Hartford, and we certainly can't run from them. What we need to do is hit them head on and expose these failures for what they are. I'll leave you with one example, and I already said it. It's about the mobile home parks. They are not mobile, folks. And the fact, just because Hartford says it's not affordable, doesn't mean that it's not affordable. Go look at Wolf Hill, for, West Center Street. It's all very affordable multifamily houses in great neighborhoods where most of our families that grew up here grew up. And we have factory squares looking at housing. We have 200 and something units coming downtown at the old Ideal Forge. We have on the old Germanio property, we have things coming. We have great housing in this community. And I'm proud to say that. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that, we're exclusionary. We are not exclusionary in this community. And I think we should all admit that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Are there any other comments from a member of the public? Mr. Del Santo.
Hello, everyone. Mike Del Santo. I'm at 70 Southington Avenue in Southington. You brought up something earlier, Glenn, that I kind of I related to it. I own a small apartment building. About 17 years ago, my brother and I bought a small apartment building here in Southington, and I had a little bit of a stretch where I couldn't find renters. It was just, I had 2 empty apartments, and we were losing our shirts. So I looked into possibly allowing them to be affordable. And the problem with Southington is reaching a human being to help you to list it as affordable housing. I want to say at the time, this was at least 12 or 13 years ago. So I don't know what it's like now, because we fixed the place up and we made some adjustments and we're okay now. But at the time I was scrambling. I had to get renters. And I remember at the time trying to call the office to list my apartments as affordable housing. I think at the time it was Section 8, whatever they called it. And it was an office in West Hartford. And it was West Hartford, Farmington, and Southington were the 3 towns that this office handled. And they were literally open Wednesdays from 1 to 4. You couldn't get a human being. I'd leave messages and we'd miss each other and I'd try to call back and then a week would go by because they were literally only open 1 day a week. So I don't know if that's changed. Like I said, it was a long time ago. But when Glenn brought it up, the resources probably aren't there for, and I consider myself pretty smart and I know how to use a telephone. But when you can't reach a human being just to try to help you, I gave up. After 6 months of playing phone tag and there was a place where you can go and put a piece of paper up to list your apartment. It was so antiquated, the whole process. So I gave up. So maybe that's part of the problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Any other members of the public who'd like to speak? No one? Mr. Cooper?
Richard Cooper, 79 Barbara Lane. I'll be brief, I guess. I mean, I'm looking around this room and I really don't see many people even close to my age here. So I would just like to ask this council, when devising a plan going forward, that we don't forget that we have young people in this town too. They might not show up to meetings, but they are here. And it's not just the price of housing that's gone up. It's also the cost of living. So we have to be mindful of those things. That's it.
Yep. Thank you, Rich.
Hi there, Tom Catrichala, 204 Stonegate Road. This was a really great presentation. It was really educational. I purchased a home this past December, and that home was right in the middle of that block picture you had, where it was like 100,000 at the bottom and 500,000 at the top. We were smack dab in the middle at 300,000, right? And it was still extremely difficult to get a home that was affordable because, as others have said, it's very difficult for especially the younger generation to afford homes. Cost of living is going up. Housing is exponentially increasing. I see housing development all over Southington that is going to be most likely sold for $400,000, $500,000. They're going to be empty, right? So I appreciate the plan that that we'll be working towards, and I hope we keep in mind that it's not just older folks. It's not just, while they are important, the older folks, the assisted living. There's also newer people that we want to get and incentivize to come to Southington. A lot of them are not going to be able to afford $300,000 to $500,000 homes. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Any other member of the public? Going once? Don't see anybody. Glenn?
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to thank everybody for showing up here tonight. I think our process going forward is to continue to collect information which is relevant to this effort. Your comments tonight are going to help us do that. I think sometime over the holidays, we'll actually start to get a chance to get something together in beginning of the year. We'll share it with the commission, get comments and feedback. We'll have another public meeting, give you an opportunity to give us some additional input as we move forward and carry this forward. As I indicated earlier, the state requirement is we be adopted by June, but I think we have time between now and then to get your input, to talk through ideas, et cetera. And your input tonight has been very helpful. So, Mr. Chairman, back to you.
To somebody.
Yeah, good question, Robert. Yeah, I'm gonna open it up to members of the commission just to see if they have any questions or any comments that might help inform, I'll call it a first draft of whatever
Great.
plan we're coming up with. Commissioner Salka just raised a valid point, I think. If there's contact information for you, Glenn, for anybody who couldn't be here tonight, or just doesn't feel comfortable talking in front of a crowd, or just has a question that they want to ask you, is there some way, Mary Ellen, for us to get that up on the website and to get that out to the public so that they have the opportunity to reach out to you individually?
I think what I would prefer that any correspondence or anything else, either from the public or from the commission, go through Mary Ellen. I think, and then she can make sure that she's keeping track of all the stuff. It all comes to me. I can respond, copy her back on stuff, and then we'll maintain some measure of control or management over this. I think the worst situation is something would fall down my email chain and I'd forget to respond and people would think that I wasn't paying attention. And so I think, again, so if everything goes through Mary Ellen from whatever way to me and then
point,
back,
yep.
I think that'd be a great way to manage this going forward.
Ready for that onslaught of emails, Marielle?
I think one thing would be try to get it out to the public, though, that, you know, that this is available. If Mary Ellen has it and she can take the information, but if the people don't know it's there, I don't know how we could communicate that out to the Southington residents that.
Well, let me try this. Jesse Buchanan sitting in the back there. I would encourage residents of the town of Southington to contact Mary Ellen Edwards at the planning office with any comments, questions, or to express an opinion throughout this process. Her telephone number. We won't go that far. I mean, she's in the book, so to speak, but that's my comment on tonight. So, but valid point, Bob. I appreciate you raising that. Let's open it up to members of the commission and Peter.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. So Glenn, thank you for tonight. And I think it's important for us to understand that there's the state requirement for which we're under our 10%, 5 point, whatever it is, for all those rules. And there's also the need to provide inexpensive homes or inexpensive housing. And because if a developer came in tomorrow and said, I know I'm going to take a bath on it, but I'm going to make $1,000, $200,000 homes, ranch houses that, you know, P.J. Delahunty and Eric Hetty did years ago, none of that would meet the state criteria. It may help people afford it, help young people, help all that afford it, but it does nothing to the state calculation because it doesn't fit that criteria.
Correct. I think
Right.
I'd like to share with the commission, I think our objectives are twofold. Number one is the state criteria and how could we've already got 967 units. It's kind of a surprising number, but can we do more? And then I think the other part of that is the naturally occurring affordable housing to meet people's needs.
Correct.
Without resale and other restrictions.
Agree. Because I think the point that Tom and Mr. Cooper raised in regards to younger folks, younger families is exceedingly valid because here we're very reactive. We're not in the development business, planning and zoning. So people come to us and say, here, I got an idea for development. Here you go. And we either get, quite honestly, 55 and up, either with higher density or not, or $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 developments. There's really not any, I can't remember the last time we got anything other than that. So that's what's coming toward us. So I think the words in regards to how do you incentivize other things, I'd be wanting to know what that is because by the time it gets to us, it's almost too late. As you know, somebody comes in with a housing development, we're obligated to say yes to that unless it's a special permit. By law. Only special permit allows us certain criteria to have a public hearing and have other jurisdictions. So by the time it gets to us, it's almost too late. So what strategies do we have either by change of zoning regulations, like you say, or working with economic development, what have you, before it gets to us? Because when it gets to us, it's later in the process. So how do we promote and how do we do whatever it is to get other things here? Because otherwise it's too late. The thing that we haven't talked about here, though, is open space. Because we've made a concerted effort in this town to buy open space to preserve land. Because the biggest thing that I get here is stop building, stop approving all building, you're ruining Southington. Okay. We should have 1 or 2 acre lots across town. Why can't you guys do that? Because it's illegal. And if you have to do it, no density. All that flies in the face of all of this. So how do we continue to preserve farmland? How do we consider to preserve open space while trying to provide this stuff? That's a delicate balancing act. And so I think in anything we do, I think we want to continue to preserve land. I think. I mean, everybody else could talk. I don't want to talk for the commission, but I think we've done a nice job, this commission has and town has, about buying open space and trying to preserve as much as we can to try to hear the town and not build in general. But we still have to provide, because I think the points are all valid, how to get things that people can afford to do all that. So that's a delicate balancing act. And I think that needs to be part of any strategy that we have, because I don't think we want to give that up. I mean, you guys could disagree with me, but I don't think we want to give that up.
Could I just respond to some of the things, and Peter, great points I think that you brought up. To be proactive, one of the things we have done, and I'm not sure how much you're aware of this, Glenn, but or residents of the public, is that we approved a zone regulation that sets up what's called age-restricted cluster housing, or an ARC zone. And what that does is it's limited, again, to over 55, residents over 55, no child under the age of 18 in the household. But the flip side of that is that we require any development under the ARC zone, 10% of which has to be set aside for affordable housing. So that's sort of a proactive step that we've taken over recent years. The bigger thing I wanted to talk about that you touched on, Peter, I'm glad you brought it up, is that I don't want to see this become a debate or a pitting open space preservation, farmland preservation against affordable housing. I don't think that they run counter to each other. I think that there's room for both of them, and certainly open space has been something that we have promoted along with members of the town council, working with them in the open space committee. It's been something that I've been proud of. I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago when we were here, so it's something that I continue to try to look for. But I don't want to see those two ideas run counter to each other. I think that there's room for both, and I think that whatever strategy we come up with should recognize that. The other thing I'll say, and I talked to you about this earlier, Glenn, is that some of our land in Southington is non-developable. By that I mean we have ridge lines here. You can't build a house on a ridge line. There are state statutes against that, and two, physically, you just can't do it unless you want to tear down the entire ridgeline, which I don't think anybody wants to see happening on any level of government, for that matter. So I think that should be something that needs to be mentioned at the very least. The last thing I'll say is that when we talk about affordable housing in certain areas of our town, are those properties able to geologically provide for adequate disposal of waste and that type of stuff? Because that is an issue, right? I mean, you don't want to put a housing development on a piece of property that isn't going to be able to support a septic system or provide for water. And that's part of the reason I think why we have requirements for public water and public sewer. But, which isn't a be-all, end-all, but we certainly had one here not too long ago. It's still actively active, so I won't say much about it, but where that did become a topic of conversation. And the last thing I'll say is that there are affordable housing plans or developments that we have approved. We did one 2 years ago on Liberty Street. No shovel, I don't think a shovel has gone in the ground unless someone's been up there to see that that's happened. But it is an approved affordable housing development for which we will not get credit until that development is completed, right? So that too feeds into the system. Mike Riccio mentioned the old Ideal Foraging property down there. I would imagine that, which too has already been approved by planning and zoning, They have an active approval there, but I would imagine that some component of that development, when and if it ever does get developed, would have an affordable part to that as well. So I think that that's something that is important to note as well. But with that, any other members of the commission? Caleb?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I kind of want to pick up where Peter kind of left off, and also from Mr. Del Santo and Mr. Riccio, about how do we get to there. And I live in the Wolf Hill neighborhood. It's an old neighborhood, a lot of multifamily housing, dating back to the 20s to 40s, to the post-war era. And my thought is, with what we have existing and kind of what these gentlemen had already said, how do we get there with what we already have? And we kind of talked about deed restricted a little bit. And I mean, I get the concept, and I might be missing some of the larger points, but is there a way to incentivize the property owners of the buildings that on market value will demand a lower rent, to be able to have those property owners agree to a 25 or 40-year land record agreement saying that this is going to be in this affordable market range? And I guess it could change. I don't exactly know the specifics of it, but can it move along with the market as 10, 20, 40 years along? Excuse me. So I don't know if that could happen, how we would incentivize that, if it's an act of the town council to consider incentivizing it through tax abatements or however we would do that. But is that a way to get there with what we have?
Yeah, I mentioned to Glenn earlier too, Caleb, I think this is the same point you're trying to make, is that for those natural, what do they call them, naturally occurring affordable units, which don't count towards affordable housing stock, is there a way to modify that on a rolling basis? So say like every, you count it, it doesn't need to be deed restricted, you count it, and then every year or every 5 years, pick a number, you do a census of whether those units are still quote unquote affordable, whether they fit below that standard of what the state formula sets it at. Because Mike is right. There are those units around here that, rent for less than what we would qualify as affordable, but yet they don't qualify as affordable because they don't meet every single criteria that's set by the state statute. So I think that part of this has to do with the state bending a little bit to come in line with what the reality is, and maybe look at their statutes as well. So Steve Olowski, I know, is going to work with us on that as well. So, but I think that's what one second, Steve, I think that's what you're kind of saying. Am I right?
It's kind of the direction I'm going.
Yeah.
If there was a way for us to build, I don't know, build ordinances or regulation town-wide. And again, this is a town problem. This isn't necessarily an art.
Right.
This is a town issue that we have to do. How do we satisfy those state regulations and work it into what we have?
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna say that the state is gonna bend to us. I think that we're gonna have to try to find them in the middle somewhere.
Yeah.
So I hope, Steve, I hope you can do a lot of magic up in Hartford. But
Well, compromise is a two-way street. So, Steve.
I just wanted to ask if there's a way to expand on what Caleb is saying, what you were saying, Bob. Can the study include what we have for inventory in terms of apartments and mobile homes, and what do we have in terms of units, so that we know collectively as a town how we're serving our citizens? What is that number, and where does it put us on in terms of the number of units that, in terms of the percentages, just so that we know what we're dealing
Agreed,
with.
Totally.
In terms of the total number.
Right. Like, what's the housing stock below $300,000?
Right.
Like,
Right.
what do we got? Like, how many is it? Where is it? So not only how many, but where.
I want to temper your expectations just a little bit, only in the following sense that we have a scenario right now, we're in a little bit of a data desert, okay? So the best information that's available, believe it or not, is still the 2010 census, okay? That data is 11 years old. The 2020 census, the data was collected as of April 1, 2020, which is why they call it the 2020 census, but the information is supposed to be released until May. And our plan needs to be adopted in May for June. So we're not going to really have a chance to use that. The other information that's available is something called the American Community Survey, which is based on a very small sample of the population each year. And for some data, the margin of error is bigger than the number itself. So we have to use information from different sources and treat it a little bit like an impressionist painting. Every piece is a little color and it paints a picture, but each color by itself doesn't sort of really tell us everything we want to know.
VGSI isn't accessible?
What's that?
VGSI isn't accessible?
VGSI.
The database that assessors use to tell you what you
Oh, the
got?
vision government solution.
Vision thing, yeah.
It is. The challenge we sometimes have with that is that that includes the sale information, but not the rental. And so the rental is 17. So yeah, we can look at that information.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. And it is.
It's a more recent look. It's not the
It is
entire
recent,
look, but it
right.
gives you something.
He was talking about Steve was talking about a comprehensive data set.
Yeah, I mean,
and the issue is we might have to mix and match. So
Perfect situation, that's what we could get, but I mean, let's see
So if you
what,
could get-
what you can come up with.
Yeah, because I mean, VGSI is what we all look at.
You good, Steve? All right.
No, I think Caleb brings up a good point because, as we know, there's not a lot of available land in town to build. There's not large swaths of land anymore. Really isn't. There's some, but there's not. Like we try to buy it all, or it's not buildable, whatever it is. So I think your point is a good one in regards to how can we work with what we have, and I think incentivize things is a word to be used. I mean, we incentivize business to come, right? And so, is there other incentivized things in regards to certain kind of housing? Don't know, but that word just keeps going in my head. I think the gentleman over there use that word. I think that's the right thing because otherwise, by the time it gets to us, we're kind of late in the process.
Nick?
I would just like to point out that while the cost burden for those that own their homes is, it's relatively low and on par with the rest of the state, that the cost burden rate for renters is 38%. So it's significantly higher if you're looking to rent. And it's very difficult to build income in order to eventually own a home, and especially if the buy-in price is so high. It doesn't really incentivize people to keep living here. So I believe that you guys have certainly more experience working with this than I do, but how we at least, and there are a whole lot of macro concepts beyond that. What we can do to address it, if we could bring that down, 2%, that'd be something.
No, it's a great point.
So Nick, as our youngest member, you carry a lot on your shoulders to represent that segment of the population. So, just under 30 years old, I think. So
yeah, just barely hit 30.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I'm still young at heart, but I'm not.
Yeah.
My
my
driver's
brain-
license says
my
something
brain
different.
is-
Jen?
Glenn, thank you. I had no doubt that was going to be an excellent presentation. But I think you just brought up a good point. 2010 is our last data. We're shooting in the dark for a number that we don't even know we can reach. So while that is something that we're looking at through this plan, I think the focus should be on the community need. We did address that in the 2016 Plan of Conservation with public input, but I think that we can also include that as well, just to back up what that community need is here presently. And a few other things, I agree. I would love to have what we have in the queue included, because that counts. We're actively working on affordable housing in those segments. So we know that the process is developer driven. It starts with the developer. So what can we do? What are some types of things that we can do to alleviate our responsibility? Like, as Peter points out, we have to approve items. We don't have a lot of, there's not a lot of leeway there. A developer needs to make money. It's their living. So what are the types of things that we are able to do? And we've been given some information, and one of the things, some of the information is highly critical. And so I'm wondering, how do we get around these things? One of the things, Desegregate Connecticut suggested we create more sensible lot sizes. And so how do we do that as a community without impeding landowners and devaluing land?
I think so. There's a number of different organizations out there that have all sorts of opinions about what Southington should be doing in terms of its land use approach. And I think, as you had stated earlier in your comments, I think it's important for us, for the commission, to think about what works best for Southington, different types of approaches. As part of the Plan of Conservation and Development, we recognize that Southington is a very unique geography. We have this sort of flat plain with the hills and then the ridges, and the zoning reflects that, so that the more challenging, difficult areas are the larger lot sizes, and we're not really planning on extending sewers in those areas or public water, and so the maps in the POCD reflect that. So I think, as was stated earlier, I think we can find ways to balance open space and agricultural preservation and provide for housing choices and options, but each of them is going to have sort of their own place. And so the question is, we're building a community trying to bring all of these things together and not focus on one just over the others. We're going to have to try to find that balance. And that's why I think the Planning and Zoning Commission is a great group to do this, because of the work on the POCD and the concept of balance. And so I think your comments and the comments we heard tonight are going to help us in that effort.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Kat?
So along the lines of cost of building, are there funding opportunities, meaning grants? Are there grants that we might be able to take advantage of to help offset the cost of build, to incentivize different types of homes?
So I feel like I need to give a little bit of a history lesson here, in a sense that for many, many years, I mean, zoning didn't exist in most communities in Connecticut, let's say 50 to 60, 70 years ago. All right. It's really been a construct in the last half century or so. We've always had housing cost challenges. I mean, at one point in time, we really didn't have a mortgage market. You had to buy a house for cash. So we've made a lot of improvements along the way in terms of housing gets provided, how it gets built. We ended up with the sort of the system that we have today. But for many, many years, the government provided or addressed the concept of lower income or housing for lower income people and families. It's really since 1989 that this concept it's being privatized, that the responsibility was put on developers, developments, and local planning and zoning commissions to address housing at 80% and 60% of area median income. And so towns are in the process of adjusting their zoning regulations to start to address and accommodate this. The state has not, because state and federal governments couldn't keep up with the cost of lower income housing. They exported it to municipalities and brought municipalities into the mix through this statutory situation. So is there a lot of money available? No, there's not. Some towns are setting up housing trust funds, which is a way to collect money, which then can be devoted to housing. And I think that's something that we can talk about for Southington to consider. Some communities are looking at things such as tax incentives to deed restrict existing housing units. And so, is it cash? No, it's not, but it's kind of forgiving or giving up a little money that you might have received through tax revenue, and that has its own set of questions, et cetera. So there are no major pots of money out there. The money that CHFA and the state has tends to go towards housing authorities, which deal with the challenges of the most needy. And so we're going to have to cobble something together, which is going to help us have tools to address these types of things. But unfortunately, big pots of money haven't shown up yet.
Gotcha.
But St. Patrick's Day is just...
Come just in time.
I don't have enough markers to draw a color grade.
Kat, you all set?
Yes, thank you.
Any other comments from members of the commission? Any other comments from members of the public after you heard us talk? Yeah, come on up.
My name Joe Simzak. I live at 18 Rye Hill Drive. Great presentation. My head is spinning here with all the facts and everything else, so part of it. But I read something recently, I think it was in the Southington Citizen or maybe on the internet or something, that the town of Southington was able to opt out of affordable housing the last time it came up. Did I read incorrectly, or?
No, what happened recently within the last couple of months is that there was a state law that was passed that would have allowed for what's called ADUs, accessory dwelling units, by right, which meant that anybody who wanted to build a structure on their single family house lot would be allowed to go down to town hall, pull a permit without input from this body, this elected body, and build that structure. There was an opt-out clause in that piece of legislation. It required a supermajority by this body as well as the town council, which happened, that we did opt out of the ADU requirements of that public act.
And that act actually said those things cannot be used for affordable housing calculation. So it said right in there, could not use those for affordable housing.
So we can't opt out anymore?
We did.
We did opt out, yes.
Okay.
We did opt out for those. Correct.
For those. Well, I'm
But if we
talking about-
opted in, it wouldn't be able to be used for affordable housing anyway.
It seems to me, and again, I get all these facts in front of me with some great comments over here as well, that we're trying to appease the state by taking on the Affordable Act here. And as a result, all these questions are popping up. How do we do this? How do we do that? Well, if you have the option of opting out again, which you guys would know better than I, why not do that? Me, I'm of the opinion Southington is built up just fine. I'd rather not see any more building going up in Southington. Been here for a number of years now, and as we all know, Route 10 traffic is ridiculous. The housing that they're building on Loper Street now, I think, is crazy. I think you're going to see a lot of accidents. As somebody who's driven down that street in my working career, I don't know how many times. So I don't even want to see normal housing. I think we've got enough. You know, I don't want to see any more buses on, I don't want to see buses on Route 10. I don't want to see that many more cars. I come from an area a long time ago, perhaps you could tell by my accent, is from Brooklyn, New York. And I know what city living is like. And I got the hell out of there because I didn't want that anymore. And it seems like, with all this, we're heading back to that. That's just my opinion. A lot of people won't like it. But, you know, stepping back from affordable housing, I don't want to see any more housing, but if that has to be, why do we want to grab everybody across the state and put them into Connecticut, into Southington? When I first moved out, we were my wife and I were looking at places in Simsbury and Avon. Yeah, I couldn't afford them. Now I could afford Southington. You know, it's just like everybody else went through the same thing, I'm sure. So to hear that we have to appease the state by their requirements, it baffles me that we don't have a way of saying no.
So Joe, I appreciate your comments. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Wolowski, who's our legislative point person down here on the left-hand side, and let him sort of address some of the things that you brought up. So,
I mean, in terms of opting out, I believe you agree with what we said, that the state was trying to tell us that these accessory dwelling units were going to be allowed, and we said, no, we don't want them to. You know, where your next door neighbor could say, I'm going to put a 10 by 10 unit in my backyard, and we had no oversight over it, and he didn't even have to tell you that was going to happen. He could just go get a permit and do it. So, you know, I think we're on the same page that, you know, we are doing what we can here to prevent everything that the state is passing down our way.
Okay, I just, like I said, I'm listening to everybody, and they're all great comments, and I'm getting confused with can we, can't we? What are our options? Enough said. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate you coming out. Any other members of the public who'd like to speak? Sev?
Wow. I was waiting for Seb to say something.
Save the best for last.
Jeez, Seb.
How are you? Sev Bovino, 285 Hightower Road, Southington. Along the lines of what you can do to help bring affordable units, here's what I think is increase the amount of R12 zones. Over the years, the plan of development always talked about increase the R12 zone areas, and it hasn't not been done. Allow rental units above existing buildings in the retail areas. There's quite a few buildings in town, because there's no demand for second-story office space, they're empty. And so I think they should be utilized for apartments for people to have an affordable rent. And always was allowed. It's allowed in a CB zone, an industrial zone, and R12 zones. The other thing, some of the B zone land, it's not suitable for business use. So you should allow, in the appropriate area, to allow residential in a B zone. It used to be like that. We've done quite a few condos in a B zone. It got to the point where the commission decided it was too much development in a B zone, and you were concerned that we were removing a lot of the potential for businesses away from happening and have, residential. But now we're at that point where we got a lot of business. Some of them are empty, and the future doesn't look good. The demand for business, retail, it's not there. So you should consider in some specific areas to allow that. So above existing building, allow the rental, R12 zones, and consider some B zone areas to allow multifamilies. And there was another areas. Smaller lots. I mean, we have Todd Road, Russell Road, Homesdale Avenue. We have, and those locations are looking good. I mean, and they allowed families from the last war to have a small piece of the American dream, small cape, and so 6,000 square foot lot is plenty to have a small house on. So in the appropriate area, like the chairman said, with public water and sewer in certain areas, you could allow that.
Thanks, Sev.
So that does not give you the affordable housing as the state determines it, but it gives you the affordable units for the population to use.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks,
Thanks, Seb.
Any other members of the public who would like to provide comment before we close the meeting up? Seeing none, Glenn? You all set?
Thank you, Commission. Thank you, public, and hope to see you as the plan comes together.
Hey, Glenn, we're on a timeline. You want to give us a brief sketch of the overview on the timeline on this?
I have a couple more meetings, interviews to be doing as part of my work. So I would imagine that over the holidays, I will be trying to assemble a preliminary draft for discussion. It's not the final plan. These are not, by the way, 50 or 60 page things, but it's going to be an organization of thoughts to continue our discussion, because I look forward to your comments and refinement as we move forward. So imagine, I don't know if it's appropriate to wish everybody Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, etc. But
Happy
I imagine
festivals.
I'll see you after the first of the year.
After the first.
Thanks, Glenn. Mary Ellen, anything to add before we close up? Anyone else have anything to add?
Nope.
Seeing none, Bob
Just
Salko,
a
go
quick
ahead.
question. Has there been any thought of Glenn and perhaps this commission inviting the local builders and the planning people like Seb, and to sit down and really hash out concerns they have, whether it be prices of lots, building costs, and people like Mike, people that have a lot of rental houses in this town, get together and really hash that out and get some real input of what their concerns might be. We've heard from, the audience, the population, the homeowners, but if we get together, perhaps those kinds of people and hear what their input is as well, we might get some good input of things that are possible that we perhaps haven't thought about or some limitations saying that's just not possible in Southington. If you've got to spend $100,000 for a lot, regardless of what size, how do you build a $100,000 house? It ain't happening. So I'm just wondering if some thought given to that as well.
Yeah,
I think it might be a good idea.
I have been conducting meetings already, and some of the groups that you mentioned I've already met with. So I am planning on scheduling additional meetings to get the information I feel I need to prepare information for you. So I may circle back with some of those groups, but I've talked to developers, engineers already, and gotten some great input. So.
Thank you.
So just commission sort of administrative business. We're back here again a week from tonight on December 7th. The plan right now is to have our group picture taken, so more information will be forthcoming on that, so check your emails.
You have to dress nice?
Well, you can dress any way you want to,
All right.
but, seeing no other business in front of us, make a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.
Well, I got a tie-dye.
Run for help.
Right.